The first thing Prefect-Envoy Iselye Vannareth noticed about the human was that he did not look at her. Everyone looked at her. That was the arithmetic of her life, and had been since she was a child on the terraces of Vannareth, where the servants had learned to track her the way sailors track weather. She knew the feeling of a room's attention the way other people know the feeling of a draft. The human, standing at parade rest 3 paces behind and to the left of her chair in the receiving bay of Vessendar Station, was watching the doors. Not one door, all of them. She caught it in the periphery of her vision while the station master recited the welcome liturgy. A slow, dull, competent sweep of his attention, left to right and back again, that included the main hatch, the 2 service accesses, the freight shutter nobody used, and for reasons she could not fathom, the ceiling. He had been assigned to her 4 days ago. She had not learned his name. And the Imperium's gratitude for your patience, Prefect-Envoy, the station master was saying, folding his 4 hands into the traditional knot of apology. He was a sea-thin, squat and gray and glossy, and he had been apologizing since the moment her cutter kissed the dock. The delegation from House Drawl arrived early. We have had to reallocate certain suites. You have given my suite to Consul Drawl, Iselye said. The station master's apology knot tightened. It was a matter of logistics. It was a matter of logistics, she agreed pleasantly, and let the silence sit until his gills flickered. Then she smiled with the precise number of teeth that Ilvaran nobility used to indicate that a thing had been noted and would be remembered, and she rose, and the receiving bay rose with her, and she walked out. Behind her the human moved. She did not have to look to know it. He made a sound when he walked that she had spent 4 days learning to hate, not a loud sound. That was the problem. It was not any sound at all. He weighed 100 kilograms in his boots and his armor. He was built like something poured into a mold and left to cool, and he crossed a marble floor more quietly than her attaché, who weighed half as much and floated. He's fashionable, Oren Sath said in the lift. Oren was her attaché, her cousin twice removed, and the only person alive permitted to say things to her in that particular tone. He was thin even by Ilvaran standards, all filament hair and long wrists, and he had a courtier's gift for pronouncing an insult as though it were weather. He's an auxiliary, Iselye said. He's a human auxiliary. Oren adjusted the fall of his sleeve in the lift's mirrored wall, and behind him, small in the reflection, the human stood in the corner with his back to nothing and his eyes half-lidded. Half the Sable Bench is taking human guards now. Lady Saracen has 2. She stands them behind her at supper like a pair of very serious lamps. I did not request him. No, the Corps allocated him, which tells you what the Corps thinks of the danger to you, doesn't it? If they thought there was danger, they'd have sent Vorak. That landed, and Oren knew it had landed, and had the grace to look at his sleeve while it did. The Vorak were the Imperium's teeth. 2.5 meters of gray muscle and stacked cartilage plate, bred over 9,000 years for the specific and highly regarded purpose of standing next to important people and being unbearable to look at. A Vorak in the corridor meant the Imperium had decided you mattered. The Corps had sent her a human, 23 standard years old, according to the file she had skimmed and closed, ordinary height for his kind, which was to say short. Brown-haired, brown-eyed, brown all the way through, a species with no gloss on it, no iridescence, no fine bones, a face like a door. And in sending him, the Corps had told every delegation on Vessendar Station exactly how much the Imperium expected the Orlane negotiations to matter. The lift chimed. The doors opened onto the corridor of her reallocated, inferior, entirely adequate suite, and the human stepped out first. He did it without being asked and without asking. He simply moved past her, not rudely, not even quickly, but with a kind of unhurried inevitability, like water finding the low place. And he was in the corridor, and his head turned, and he took the entire length of it in one long, slow look before he stopped and stood aside and made a small gesture with two fingers that meant, apparently, asterisk now asterisk. "Auxiliary," she said, "did you just clear the corridor?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you imagine that the corridor required clearing?" A pause, not the pause of a man deciding whether to lie. The pause of a man deciding how many words the answer needed. "No, ma'am," he said. "It didn't." "Then why?" "Because I didn't know that yet." He said it the way one says because it was raining. There was no defiance in it and no apology either, and Iselye, who had spent her adult life in rooms where every sentence carried 3 meanings and at least one debt, found she had nowhere to put it. She walked past him into the suite, and the doors sealed, and she stood in the middle of the dim, expensive room with her hands very still at her sides and thought, with a coldness that surprised her. "They have given me a shovel and told me to build a house." Here is what Iselye Vannareth was, on the 4th day of the Vessendar concessions. In the 90th year of a life her people expected to last 300. She was the last competent member of a house that had spent 4 generations being expensively incompetent. House Vannareth had once held 9 seats and a fleet charter. It now held 2 seats and a debt schedule that Iselye had memorized down to the decimal because she was the only one who read it. She was also, and this was the part she never said aloud, not to Oren, not to anyone, she was also frightened. Not of Consul Drawl, who was a thug in a good coat, and who wanted the Tarn Lane the way a starving thing wants a bone. She was frightened of the specific and unglamorous possibility that she would do everything correctly, and it would not be enough, that she would prepare and calculate, and hold her face perfectly still for 11 days, and the lane would go to Drawl anyway, because the Imperium in its ancient wisdom had never once in its history rewarded a house for being right asterisk. So she did what she had always done with fear, which was to file it and lock the drawer and become very, very controlled. Control was the only inheritance that had come to her unspoiled. She woke at the same hour. She ate the same weight. She held her spine like a proof. And when the Corps sent her a human boy in auxiliary gray instead of a Vorek in ceremonial plate, she did not permit herself to feel the insult. She simply logged it in the same cold ledger where she logged every other small stone the universe had set in her path. The boy was one more stone. She did not think about him again until supper. Supper was in the Aulic Gallery, which was the largest and most beautiful room on Vessendar Station, and had been designed, Iselye thought, by someone who hated the people who would use it. It was 100 meters long and half as high, a vault of white stone and hanging Concord banners, and the delegates dined at a single table down the middle of it beneath 9 tiers of empty galleries, so that every one of them ate their supper feeling watched by an audience that was not there. The acoustics were merciless. A dropped fork was an event. The human hated it. She noticed because she was bored, Consul Drawl was 3 seats down, and had spent the fish course explaining tonnage to a sea-thin who already knew about tonnage. And because, when she looked around, the human was the only thing in the room that was moving. Not moving, that was wrong. He was standing perfectly still against the wall with the other guards, 6 of them in a row, and the difference between him and the other 5 was so small that she could not immediately name it. Then she had it. The other 5 were looking at the table. Of course they were. Everyone looked at the table. The table was where the important people were. That was what a guard was asterisk for asterisk. The human was looking at the galleries. 9 tiers of empty stone balconies, dark, unlit, closed for 200 years except during quorum. He was looking at them the way a farmer looks at a sky, slow, unhurried, left to right. Then the doors she counted with him without meaning to. There were 4, no 5. There was one behind the serving screen she had not registered. And then the ceiling, again the ceiling, and then back to the galleries. He is looking for the high ground, she thought. And then, immediately after, with a flick of contempt so practiced, it was almost affection for herself. He is looking for it because he has nothing else to do. He is 100 kilograms of hired attention with nowhere to put itself, and so he counts balconies. She turned back to the table. Consul Drawl had stopped talking about tonnage. He was smiling at her. Vekit Drawl was Ilvaran like her, but he was Ilvaran the way a hammer is a tool, technically, and without any of the associated grace. He was 400 and some, and he had spent so many decades being the largest presence in every room he entered that he no longer bothered to lower his voice for anyone. Prefect-Envoy, he said into the terrible acoustics. Forgive me, I could not help but admire your escort. He is very compact. I am told they are very strong. Is it true they can be taught to run down prey? There was laughter, not cruel laughter. Worse, comfortable laughter, the kind that assumes the thing being laughed at is not in the room in any sense that matters. Iselye felt something move in her chest and did not identify it. He is an auxiliary of the Imperial Corps, she said coolly. I have not tested his running. More laughter. Drawl spread his hands, delighted and half-turned in his seat, and raised his voice to the wall. Auxiliary, come here. Yes, you. Come, nobody will eat you. He waited while the human did not move, and then his smile thinned by 1 degree. It's an instruction, boy. The human's eyes went to Iselye. That was the moment. She thought about it later many times in a dark place with her hands shaking, and she always came back to that. He did not look to Drawl, and he did not look to the corps officer at the end of the table, and he did not look to the exits. He looked at her, and he waited, because in the entire architecture of his obligations she was the only door that mattered. And she, because Drawl was watching, because the room was watching, because refusing would have been an asterisk statement, and a statement was a thing you could not take back in the 4th day of an 11-day negotiation. She inclined her head 1 centimeter. Go. He went. He crossed the white floor without hurrying and stopped at a distance that Iselye realized, with a strange small itch at the back of her skull, was exactly out of reach of every seated delegate at once. He put his hands behind his back. He said nothing. There, said Drawl. Look at it, it is like a bollard. The laughter came again, warm, easy. Boy, they say your people come from a wounded world, some ugly little rock full of teeth. Karrow, sir. Karrow. Drawl turned the word over, tasted it, found it wanting. And what does one guard on Karrow, or cattle, each other? And the human said in his plain flat voice, with no expression at all. Children mostly. The gallery gave the sentence back to them, off 9 tiers of empty stone. It was, Iselye thought afterward, the only honest thing said at that table in 11 days. It landed in the middle of the laughter like a stone in a shallow pond, and the laughter came apart around it, and for perhaps 3 seconds the Aulic gallery was entirely, ringingly silent. Then Drawl snorted and said something about nurseries, and the table found its footing again. The human went back to the wall. That was an embarrassment, Oren said afterward, walking her back. He answered Drawl asterisk, directly, without deferring. He should have said nothing and looked at his boots and let the man have his fun. You'll have him replaced. She said nothing. Oren, who could read her better than anyone living, glanced sideways and let it go. At the door of her suite she stopped and turned and looked at the human for what she realized with a small cold shock was the first time. Actually looked, not the flick of assessment she gave to furniture and functionaries. Looked. He was young. She had read the number, but the number had been an abstraction and the face was not. There was a scar under his left eye, old and white and thin, the kind a child gets. His hands were wrong for a boy, heavy-knuckled, scarred across the backs, the hands of a laborer or a fighter or both, on a body that had not yet finished filling out its own frame. He was standing, she noticed, with his weight very slightly forward. What is your name, auxiliary? Ferrow, ma'am, Cade Ferrow. Auxiliary Ferrow. She let the silence do its work. She was very good at silence. You will not speak in the gallery again. Yes, ma'am. You will not be spoken to in the gallery again either, if I can arrange it. It reflects on me. Yes, ma'am. Do you understand why? A pause. That pause again, the counting out of words, like coins from a very small purse. Because I'm decoration, ma'am, he said. And decoration that talks is worse than none. Iselye stood in the doorway of a suite that was not the one she had been promised, on a station where nobody thought she would win, and looked at a human boy who had just described his own position more accurately than any of her advisors had described hers. Yes, she said. And she went inside, and the door sealed, and she stood in the dark for a long moment with her hand still on the frame, and she did not know why she felt as though she had done something small and mean and irreversible. Cade Ferrow stood his watch. The corridor outside the Prefect-Envoy suite was 31 meters long. It had 2 lift accesses, 1 at each end, and 4 service panels, 2 of which were welded and 2 of which were not, and he had checked all 4 with his hand on the second night because you could not tell by looking. The ceiling had a maintenance crawl running its length, and the crawl had an inspection hatch 19 meters from the suite door, and the hatch had been opened at some point in the last 50 years, because the dust on its seal was thinner than the dust on the seal beside it. He had reported the hatch to Warden Cassault on the first day. Cassault, who ran station security and was sea-thin and enormously calm, had told him the crawl spaces were sealed at the trunk, and that human auxiliaries were reminded that station infrastructure was not their concern. There had been a note about it in his file afterward. He read all the notes. Auxiliary Ferrow, Karrow, 1.4G Colonial, continues to display persistent hypervigilance behaviors unsuited to ceremonial posting. Subject repeatedly surveys structures, exits, and personnel without instruction. Recommend remedial deportment instruction prior to further high-visibility assignment. He remembered the shape of it in the dark, the way you remember a bruise. Hypervigilance. He had looked the word up on the transit out. It meant a state of heightened threat awareness inappropriate to circumstances. Inappropriate, not wrong, not mistaken, just inappropriate, bad manners essentially, a thing that made the nice people uncomfortable. On Karrow, where the gravity pulled at 1.4 and the storm season lasted 110 days, and the threshers hunted by pressure and not by sight, they had another word for it. They just called it asterisk listening, and every child on that world could do it by 6, or they did not get to be 7. His grandmother had put him out on the porch at 4 years old and made him tell her what he heard, not what he saw. What he heard and what he smelled and what the ground was doing under his feet. Know the ground, she'd said 1,000 times in that flat, cracked voice like a stone splitting. Know the doors. Know who's tired. Everything else is decoration. He had come to the Imperium at 21 because Karrow was poor and the Corps paid, and he had spent 2 years learning that everything his grandmother taught him was, in the eyes of the great and gilded galaxy, a disorder. He stood his watch. He counted the corridor, 2 lifts, 4 panels, 1 bad hatch. And at 3:40 station time, on the 4th night, the hatch 19 meters down the corridor made a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound of a sealed thing deciding, very quietly, not to be sealed anymore. A tick, a settle, the hairline complaint of metal under a hand. Cade Ferrow did not move. He did not raise his weapon. He did not call it in. He simply began, silently in the dark, to count. The thing about the count was that it was not counting. Cade's grandmother had never been able to explain it properly, and neither could he. You did not sit there adding up numbers. You let the world lay itself out flat in your head, the ground, the doors, the wind, the weight, and then you noticed, without effort, when one piece of it changed. The count was just what you called the noticing. Weight on the far side of a panel. The metal was talking about it. Under 60 kilos on 2 points, which meant hands and knees in a crawl space. Time 3:41. Distance from the hatch to the suite door, 19 meters. He did not draw his sidearm, because a sidearm in a sealed corridor was the 4th or 5th solution to this problem, and because there was a chance, not a large one, but a real one, that this was a maintenance tech with a work order and a supervisor who did not answer his messages. He put his back to the wall on the hinge side, where the light was worst, and he waited 11 minutes. That was the part nobody understood. They thought the human thing was the violence. They thought if you scratched an auxiliary you would get something that bit. But the violence was the last 2 seconds, and everything before it was waiting, and the waiting was the whole of the art. On Karrow, a thresher would sit under a porch for 3 days without moving because a house had a smell it liked. You did not beat a thing like that by being fast. You beat it by being *stiller. At 3:52, the hatch cracked open a finger's width, and something looked out into the corridor and saw 100 kilos of auxiliary standing 4 meters away in the dark, motionless, palms open, saying nothing at all. The hatch slammed. The crawlspace boomed with the sound of a body going away from him at speed. Cade did not chase it. He stood there breathing slow, and he wrote down the time. "There is no record of maintenance activity on that level," said Warden Cassault. The Seathen's office was on the station's security spine, all gray and orderly, and he sat behind a desk built for a much larger species, and gave the impression of being entirely comfortable in it. He had 4 hands and a voice like a slow tide. "There wouldn't be," Cade said. "Sir, it wasn't maintenance. You did not see it. You did not record it or apprehend it or raise an alarm. You stood in a corridor," said Cassault, "in the dark for 11 minutes, and then something opened a hatch and shut it again." "Yes, sir." Cassault looked at him. It was very hard to read a Seathen face. The eyes were set wide and the mouth was a hinge. "Do you know how many crawl-access hatches there are on Vessendar Station? 9,040. They tick. They settle. The station is 200 years old and it is full of noises, and every one of those noises has been catalogued by people whose entire professional lives are dedicated to that catalog, and none of them are ***. He folded 2 of his hands. "There will be a note." "Yes, sir," said Cade. "I expected there would be." She heard about it, of course. Orin heard everything, and Orin told her over the morning brief while the station's false dawn came up gold across the viewport. "Your human has filed a security report. He claims a person was crawling through the ceiling outside your door at 4 in the morning, and that he confronted this person by standing very still and staring at a hatch." Orin said it with relish. Cassault was insufferable about it. He said, and I quote, "The Corps ought to consider the psychological toll of colonial upbringing." Iselye set down her cup. For a moment, a very brief moment, before her training closed over it like water over a dropped stone, she thought about the way the boy had looked at the galleries at supper. 9 tiers of empty balconies. The way his eyes had gone up before they went anywhere else. "He's frightened," she said. "He's * provincial. He is 23, and he was born on a world that kills people, and he has been dropped into a station full of nobles who talk about him as though he were a lamp." She picked her cup back up. "He is frightened. Orin and frightened people invent enemies, because an invented enemy is easier to hold than an actual insignificance." Orin blinked. "That is either very cruel or very kind, and I cannot tell which." "Neither can I," said Iselye, and went to work. Days 5, 6, 7. The concessions were the slowest violence Iselye had ever participated in. 11 days had been allotted for the disposition of the Tarn or Lane, and every one of them consisted of 11 hours of committee, in which nothing was said directly and everything was decided. Drawl was winning. He was winning the way water wins, by being present in enormous quantity and by having nowhere else to be. He had 30 staff. She had Orin. He had a fleet charter and 3 sworn client houses and the personal friendship of 2 of the 7 adjudicators. She had a debt schedule, a very good grasp of hull tonnage economics, and a face that gave away nothing. But she was, and this was the strange bitter joke of it, winning on the merits. She had built the Vannareth proposal out of arithmetic, out of 4 years of long nights with the shipping tables, and the 11 separate ways the Imperium's ore convoys had been quietly bleeding value in the Tarn corridor for a century. Draw wanted the lane so he could tax it. She wanted it so she could *fix* it, and on day 6 she watched adjudicator Vess read her transit loss projections and go very quiet, and she knew, with a jolt of something almost obscene in its hopefulness, that she might actually take this. That night she woke at 400, with the certainty that somebody was in the room. There was not. There was only the human, visible on the door monitor, standing exactly where he always stood, in exactly the same posture facing the corridor. He did not shift his weight. He did not lean on the wall. Every 90 seconds or so his head moved, unhurried, left, right, up. She thought, he has been doing that for 6 hours. He will do it for 2 more, and then he will sleep 4 hours, and then he will do it again. And something in her, some small unfashionable part that she had inherited from her mother and had never found a use for, said quietly, "That is not decoration. Whatever that is, it is not decoration." She turned off the screen and lay in the dark and did not sleep. Day 8. The Seathen steward brought fruit to the negotiating chamber, and Cade Ferrow, who had been standing at the wall for 4 hours without moving, stepped forward and took the tray. The room stopped. "Auxiliary," said Iselye, into a silence with an edge on it. He had already set the tray down on a side console, out of everyone's reach, and he was looking at the steward with that awful patient attention. "Ma'am," he said, "this isn't the steward who brought the water. The water steward has done every service in this room for 8 days. The rotation on this deck runs 4 days on, 2 off. He should have gone off yesterday and he didn't, and now he's been replaced mid-session by someone whose apron is folded wrong." Everyone looked at the apron. It was, Iselye saw, folded wrong. She had absolutely no idea how it was supposed to be folded. She had never in her life looked at the apron of a steward. But it was, evidently, folded wrong, because the steward himself had gone the particular ashen gray that Seathen go when caught. Warden Cassalt's people took him away. He turned out to be a contract worker with an expired credential and a cousin in the ore syndicate, carrying nothing more sinister than a pilfered access fob, and Cassalt made a great show of thanking the auxiliary in a tone that made *thank you* sound like "sit down." "Petty theft," Oren said afterward, dismissive. "Half this station is on the take, and he humiliated you, in front of adjudicator Vess. Snatching trays like a nervous." "Oren." "Like a nervous *animal*, Iselye, and everyone saw." "He was right, she said. It came out with more force than she intended. Oren stopped. She looked at her hands, which were perfectly still, because she had trained them to be perfectly still, and she said more quietly, "He was right, and I did not know how to be grateful for it, and so I was embarrassed instead. Which of us is the animal?" Oren wisely said nothing at all. Day 10, and Cade Ferrow could not put his finger on it. That was the worst feeling in the world, and he had grown up with it. On Karrow, in the storm season, there were days when the pressure dropped and the birds went quiet and the threshers came down off the ridge, and there was nothing you could point at. No track, no sound, just the whole world holding its breath in a way that was 1 degree wrong, and if you waited until you could point at something, you were already meat. His grandmother had a saying about that: "If you can name it, you're late." He could not name it, but he could count it, and the count on day 10 came out like this. The honor guard for the ratification ceremony had been increased from 12 to 20. 8 new faces, none of them station regulars, all wearing the livery of the adjudicators, which was odd, because the adjudicators had never in the history of the Imperium provided their own security. 3 of the 8 were Vorak. The Auxiliary Gallery, closed for 200 years above the first tier, had a light on in the 4th tier on the eastern side. Just one it had been on for 2 nights. It went out on the 3rd. The service corridor behind the gallery, which Cade had walked on his own time off shift, because nobody had told him not to, smelled of coolant, fresh coolant. There was no coolant line on that deck. He had checked the public schematic, which was the only one they would let an auxiliary see. The smell was 3 days old and getting stronger. And Warden Cassalt had personally revised the Ratification Day movement order to route the Prefect-Envoy's party through the Auxiliary Gallery's north atrium, a 200-meter open concourse under a glass ceiling, with 9 tiers of empty stone balconies looking down into it, and exactly 2 exits. Cade had looked at that order for a long time. Then he had put on his dress gray and gone to the door of Iselye Vannareth's suite, and requested, through her attaché, 4 minutes of her time. She gave him 3. She was standing at the mirror when he came in, and Orin was fastening the 11 small clasps of the Vannareth formal coat down her spine, and she did not turn around. Her face in the glass was the face she had been building for 90 years. Still, cold, symmetrical, absolutely unreadable. Behind it, her heart was going like a bird in a box. 4 years of work, 11 days of committee. In 2 hours she would stand in the Hall of Concord in front of 7 adjudicators and speak for 11 minutes, and at the end of it the Tarn Lane would go to House Vannareth or to House Drawl, and she did not know if she was more terrified of losing or of the vertiginous, unmanageable possibility that she might win. "Auxiliary," she said to the mirror. "Ma'am, the movement order for this morning routes us through the north atrium." "Yes. I'm asking you not to go that way." Orin's hand stopped on the clasps. Iselye turned around. He was standing just inside the door with his hands at his sides, and she noticed this with a small, strange lurch. He was not at parade rest. He was standing like a man who had been awake all night. There were shadows under his eyes and his jaw was tight, and he was looking directly at her, which he almost never did, which he had perhaps done twice in 11 days. "Explain," she said. And he did. He laid it out flat and plain in his short, blunt sentences in a voice with no rhetoric in it. The guard increase, the 8 new faces, the 3 Vorak, the light in the 4th tier, the coolant on a deck with no coolant, the hatch that had ticked at 3:52 on the 4th night, the revised order signed by Cassalt himself. He did not embellish. He did not say, "I think asterisk." He put the pieces on the table one at a time, like a man dealing cards, and then he stopped and stood there. The silence stretched. Orin laughed first. It came out of him high and startled. "Coolant. He's telling you about coolant asterisk." "Be quiet," said Iselye. And she stood there in the 11 clasps of her mother's coat, 2 hours from the only thing she had ever built, and she felt the fear come up out of the drawer she had locked it in, and she looked at the human boy who had put it there. Because here was the truth, and she saw it with perfect and merciless clarity. If she believed him, she could not go. And if she did not go, she forfeited. The adjudicators sat once, and the lane went to whoever was standing in the Hall of Concord at the 11th hour. And if the Vannareth chair was empty, then Drawl would have the Tarn corridor, and she would have spent 4 years of her one life building a proof that nobody ever read. And if she walked into that atrium and nothing happened, nothing at all, because a frightened colonial boy had counted the wrong number of guards and smelled the wrong smell, then she would have entered the Hall of Concord as a woman who had let her asterisk bodyguard rearrange the movements of an Imperial delegation. They would never stop laughing, not in 300 years. She looked at him. He looked back, patient, waiting, that flat, plain, unbeautiful face, and he did not push, and he did not plead, and he did not offer her a single thing to hold on to except the pieces he had put on the table. He is frightened, she thought, and frightened people invent enemies. She had said that. She had been very pleased with the sentence. "Auxiliary Pharaoh," said Iselye Vannareth. "Thank you for your diligence. We will proceed as ordered." Something went across his face. It was there and gone in less than a second, and it was not anger and it was not resentment. It was, she would understand much later in the dark with her hands shaking, it was grief. The particular grief of a person who has told the truth and been believed to be broken instead. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He turned to go. At the door he stopped, and without turning around he said, in exactly the same flat voice, "When we cross the atrium, ma'am, walk on my left. And if I put my hand on you, don't fight it." And then he was gone, and the door sealed, and Orin was saying something outraged about presumption, and Iselye Vannareth stood in front of the mirror in her mother's coat and looked at her own perfectly composed face and thought, with a coldness that had nothing to do with control, "Why did I say no?" She knew the answer. That was the unbearable part. She knew it exactly, and it fit in 4 words, and she would carry those 4 words for the rest of her long life. Because he was furniture. The north atrium of the Auxiliary Gallery was, everyone agreed, the most beautiful room in the Tarn system. It was 200 meters long, and it was roofed in glass, real glass, hand-poured in the old way, in 900 panes, and it stood on the outward face of Vesendar Station, so that the whole rusty gold curve of Tarn hung above it like a held breath. 9 tiers of stone balconies rose along its eastern wall, dark and silent, and the conquered banners of 400 client worlds hung down between them in long, slow columns of colored silk. The floor was white marble. The Vannareth party crossed it at 9:40 station time. They were 9. Iselye at the center in the 11 clasps of her mother's coat with her folio under her arm, Orin at her right, half a pace back, carrying nothing and worrying visibly, 4 core auxiliaries in ceremonial gray, 2 Seathen attendants, and Cade Ferrow on her left. He had not spoken since the suite. He walked half a step ahead of her left shoulder with his hands loose and his head up, and Iselye, who had spent 11 days not looking at him, could not now stop. He was not scanning, that was the thing. He had scanned for 11 days that slow farmer's sweep, left to right and up. He was not doing it now. He was looking at one thing. The 4th tier, eastern side, the gallery where a light had burned for 2 nights and then gone out. Iselye's mouth was dry. She thought with a kind of remote clinical horror at herself, "I am afraid, and I am afraid because he is, and that is not evidence." She thought 40 meters to the hall doors, 4 years, 11 minutes of speech. And she looked up at the 4th tier of the eastern gallery, and she saw the banner move. It was not a large movement. The conquered banners were 40 meters of silk, and they hung in still air and they did not move, and this one moved, a slow shrug, the way cloth moves when something behind it has shifted its weight. Cade Ferrow said, without raising his voice at all, "Down." And the world came apart. Later, much later, in a dark place, with her hands shaking and her mother's coat ruined, Iselye would try to lay it out in order and find that she could not. What she had was not a sequence. It was a handful of images, sharp as broken glass, and around them a great roaring blankness where her 90 years of composure had simply ceased to exist. She remembered the sound. Not gunfire. Gunfire came after. The first sound was a *snap*, a single dry crack like a bone breaking in another room, and one of the core auxiliaries, the tall one, the one who had held the lift for her that morning, stopped walking and sat down on the white marble as though he had suddenly remembered a task he needed to think about. She remembered that she did not move. She had been told to get down, and she did not get down, because 90 years of being Iselye Vannareth had built a body that did not obey the shouted instructions of auxiliaries. She remembered the hand. It came into the small of her back, and it did not push her. It lifted her, took her whole weight of bone and coat and folio off the floor with an ease her mind refused, absolutely refused, to accept, and turned her 90 degrees in the air, and set her down behind the plinth of a marble column with her spine to the stone, and the hand was gone before her knees had finished folding. She remembered her folio hitting the floor. 4 years of arithmetic, fanning out across white marble in the middle of a killing ground. And she remembered, this was the image that would come back to her at night for the rest of her long life, looking up from behind the plinth and seeing Cade Ferrow standing in the open, alone, in the center of 200 meters of white marble under 9 tiers of guns. Not running, not shooting. Listening. His head was tilted. His hands were empty. Around him the air was full of light and noise, the high whip-crack of coal fire off stone, dust jumping in white gouts from the floor, and Oren was screaming somewhere behind her, and the boy from Karrow stood in the middle of it like a man trying to catch a name he had almost remembered. He was there for perhaps 1.5 seconds. Then he moved, and after that Iselye Vannareth stopped understanding what she was looking at. Here is what Cade Ferrow heard in that 1.5 seconds. He heard 9 weapons. Not 9 shooters, 9 asterisk weapons asterisk, which was a different number and a more useful one, because 2 of them were firing on the same cadence from the same elevation, and that meant a crew-served mount, tripod, slow to traverse, and the other 7 were handheld and scattered across 3 tiers. He heard the report delay off the eastern wall and off the glass, and the difference told him the tiers. 3 shooters on 4, 2 on 5, 2 on 3, and the mount on 6. He heard boots on the north stair, 4 sets, heavy, plated, Vorek, and he heard the south doors not asterisk opening, which meant there was 1 exit and it was behind him and it was covered by the mount. And under all of it, very faintly, he heard the hiss of a coolant line venting behind the eastern wall, and he understood, all at once and with a kind of terrible calm, exactly what the coolant was for. They were not here to shoot her. They were here to hold her in this room for the 90 seconds it would take to cut the atrium's environmental trunk and blow the glass. 900 panes, 200 meters, the whole delegation going out into the dark over Tarn, and the Imperium would find a human auxiliary's body among the debris from a colony world with a file full of notes about hypervigilance and insubordination, and the story would write itself. They gave me to her, he thought, because I was nothing. Then he stopped thinking, in the way that his grandmother had taught him to stop, and he let the ground come up. The mount on 6 was the problem, everything else was noise. He went left, hard, across the open floor, not toward cover, because there was no cover between him and the eastern wall, but at the wall, straight in, closing the angle, because a tripod-mounted coil gun on a stone balcony 6 tiers up has a beautiful field of fire over the middle of a room and absolutely none directly beneath itself. Vessendar Station spun at 0.9 standard gravity. Cade Ferrow had learned to run on a world that pulled at 1.4, in boots, at 6 years old, with things behind him. He crossed 30 meters in a fraction over 3 seconds, and the mount could not follow him, and the shooters on the low tiers could not lead him. And the last 2 meters, he took off the base of a column and went up the eastern wall, not climbing, using it, 1 boot on a cornice, 1 hand on a banner hook, and caught the underside of the first-tier balustrade and pulled himself over and rolled. The Vorek on the north stair had made it to the second landing. He saw Cade come over the rail and he swung. Cade did not fight him. That was the thing that Iselye, watching from behind a marble plinth with her heart trying to climb out of her throat, could not fit into any category she possessed. The human did not fight the Vorek. There was no exchange. There was no clash. The Vorek, 2.5 meters, 400 kilos of stacked plate and gray muscle, a creature bred for 9,000 years to be the last thing an enemy of the Imperium ever saw, swung a fist the size of a helmet, and the boy from Karrow simply was not there anymore. He had stepped inside it, under the arc, past the elbow, into the space against the Vorek's chest where an arm 2.5 meters long cannot reach, and he did not punch and he did not stab. He put one hand flat on the Vorek's hip and one foot behind its heel, and he turned, and 400 kilos of Imperial teeth went over the balustrade and fell 6 meters onto white marble. The sound it made was enormous. The Vorek did not get up. It was alive. Iselye could see it moving, one arm scraping at the floor, but it was not going to get up, and it was not going to be a problem, and the boy from Karrow had already forgotten about it. He was gone up the stair. He did not enjoy it. That was the thing nobody in the Imperium would ever quite believe afterward when they read the reports, that the human had not enjoyed it. They wanted him to have enjoyed it. It was so much easier to hold, that way, the savage, the animal, the Deathworld thing let off its leash, and so much less frightening than the truth, which was that Cade Ferrow went up that stair with the same expression he wore standing in a corridor at 4 in the morning. You did not hate the storm. You did not hate the thresher under the porch. You did what the ground required, in the order the ground required it, and you did not do one thing more than that, because every extra motion was a thing that could kill you, and because, and this was the part he could not have explained to Warden Cassalt in 9,000 years, on a world that is trying to kill everyone, cruelty is a luxury nobody can afford. Third tier. 2 shooters crouched behind the balustrade, firing down into the atrium at people who were not shooting back. The first one heard him and turned, and Cade took the weapon, not the man. The weapon, trapped the barrel against the stone with the heel of his hand, and broke the wrist behind it with a short economical motion that made a sound like a wet branch, and the shooter folded and was, in the only sense that mattered to Cade Ferrow, finished. The second one got a shot off. It went past Cade's ear close enough to sting. Cade shot him, once, in the shoulder because the man was already turning to run, and because a man with a ruined shoulder does not fire a coil gun and does not need to be dead. The Karrow militia had a saying, drilled into every 14-year-old on the ridge patrols, and it had never once been about mercy. Dead men take 4 seconds. Broken men take 1. He went up. 4th tier. Iselye was crawling. She had not decided to crawl. She had simply discovered that she was on her hands and knees behind the plinth with her mother's coat torn at the shoulder and stone dust in her mouth, and that 11 meters away, in the open, Oren Sath was lying on the white marble with his hand pressed to his side and blood coming through his long, thin fingers in a way that she found, in that moment, personally and specifically unacceptable. She crawled to him. There was fire coming down from the upper tiers, and she crawled through it, and she got her hands under his arms, and she discovered that she could not lift him, that 90 years of perfect posture had not built anything capable of dragging a grown Ilvaran across open floor, and she was still failing, with the fury of the utterly helpless rising in her throat, when the fire from above simply stopped. She looked up. On the 4th tier, 40 meters away and 6 stories up, there was a very brief, very quiet series of events that she could see only in fragments through the hanging silk. A shape moving along the balcony fast and low. A shooter half rising. The shooter going over the rail, caught by his own harness, swinging. A third figure backing away with his hands up, shouting something, and the human not shooting him, just taking the weapon out of his hands and putting him on the ground with a palm on the back of his neck and leaving him there. Then the crew-served mount on the 6th tier began to traverse, hunting for the thing that was killing its escort, and the human came out of the shadows on the 5th tier stair at a dead run and went asterisk over the balustrade out into open air, 6 stories up, with nothing under him at all, and caught a conquered banner. 40 meters of hanging silk. He caught it with both hands and his whole weight tore it off its upper hooks, and he went down and out in a long ripping arc. And Iselye Vannareth, kneeling on white marble with her attaché's blood on her hands, watched a human being swing across the north atrium of the Auxiliary Gallery on the flag of a client world and land on the 6th-tier balcony in the middle of a Vorik gun crew. 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Some part of her, the part that had memorized the debt schedule and the shipping tables, took the numbers down. 4 seconds, and the gun stopped, and one Vorik came over the rail with a scream, and the other 2 did not, and there was a silence in the atrium so total that Iselye could hear the glass ceiling ticking as it cooled. He came down the stair, not running, the way a man comes down a ladder in a burning house, checking every landing, weapon up. He did not look at the bodies on the tiers. He did not look at the Vorik groaning on the marble. He came straight to her. He knelt. He put 2 fingers against Oren's throat, and then his hand flat on Oren's side, hard, and Oren made a sound like a kettle. And Cade said, in a voice so calm it was almost gentle, "He's fine, ma'am, look at me." She looked at him. There was blood on him, not much of it his. There was a burn along his left forearm where the coal fire had opened the armor and the meat beneath it, and his knuckles were split, and he was breathing hard, and his eyes were exactly the same. That was what undid her, not the Vorik, not the banner, not the impossible 30-meter sprint or the wrist breaking like a branch. It was that she looked into the face of the human who had just, alone, in under 90 seconds, dismantled a 9-gun ambush, and she found there absolutely nothing new. No transformation, no fury, no terrible light. The same flat, patient attention he had turned on a serving tray, and an apron, and a hatch in a corridor at 4 in the morning. He was not becoming something, she thought, and the thought was so cold and so clear it was like being handed her own skeleton. He is not a weapon that woke up. He has been this, standing behind my chair for 11 days, and I looked at him and I saw a lamp. "Ma'am," said Cade Ferrow, "they're going to blow the glass. We have about 40 seconds. I need you to stand up and carry his legs." And Iselye Vannareth, a Prefect-Envoy of the Imperium, 90th of her name, who had never in her life carried anything heavier than a folio, and who had never once, not one single time, been told what to do by anybody at all, stood up and took her cousin's legs, and did exactly what the boy from Karrow told her. The glass went at 9:43. They were in the service corridor behind the eastern wall when it happened, the one that smelled of coolant, the one that was not on the public schematic, the one Cade Ferrow had walked on his own time on the 9th day and been reprimanded for. He had gotten them through the access panel with 11 seconds to spare and gotten the panel closed with 4, and then the north atrium of the Auxiliary Gallery breathed out. Iselye felt it in the floor, a long shuddering asterisk whump, and then the scream of 200 meters of air leaving a room, and then a sound she would never be able to describe to anyone who had not heard it. 900 panes of hand-poured glass, some of them 3 centuries old, going out into vacuum all at once, ringing as they went, like a cathedral falling down a well. The panel bucked against Cade's shoulder. He held it. The corridor lights went red. Somewhere far off, an emergency bulkhead came down with a sound like a fist on a table, and then another, walking away down the spine of the station, sealing off the dead. The pressure equalized. The panel stopped fighting. Cade let go of it and stepped back, and his left arm was shaking, and he looked at it with mild interest, the way one looks at a piece of equipment that has begun to behave oddly, and then he ignored it. "Ma'am," he said, "we need to be somewhere else." Somewhere else turned out to be, after 90 minutes of crawling and one long horrible passage, through a ventilation trunk that Oren spent semi-conscious and Iselye spent discovering that she was mildly and unhelpfully claustrophobic, a coolant plant substation on the station's 9th underdeck. It was not a hiding place. That was the first thing Cade told her, and the second was why. "Hiding places get found, ma'am. This is a place with 3 exits and a water line and a view of the stair. He put Orin down on a pallet of insulation batting. He took the tactical kit off the wall. There was one on every plant deck. He had known that, and Iselye had not, and Iselye had been on Vesendar for 11 days, and he opened Orin's coat with a knife and went to work. Iselye watched him. She had nothing else to do. That was the most humiliating discovery of the day, and she made it sitting on a coolant housing with her mother's coat hanging off one shoulder. That in the whole of the terrible, immediate business of not dying, Iselye Vannareth was of no use whatsoever. She could read a shipping table. She could hold a face. She could take a room apart with 3 sentences and a smile. She had spent 90 years building a person of enormous and specific competence, and every gram of it had been designed for rooms where the walls stayed where they were put. Cade Ferrow packed the wound in her cousin's side with a sealant sponge, and set a clamp, and checked it, and set it again because he did not like the way the first one sat. He worked slowly. That was what she could not get over, how slowly he worked. The thing on the 4th tier had taken 4 seconds. This took 19 minutes, and twice he stopped entirely and just watched Orin's face for a while before he did the next thing. "You are very careful with him," she said, when she could not stand the humming silence anymore. "He's the patient, ma'am. He has been unforgivably rude to you for 11 days. Cade Ferrow considered this with what appeared to be genuine attention. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed, and went back to work. He dressed his own arm last, and badly and one-handed, and Iselye watched him fumble the wrap twice before she got off the coolant housing and crossed the little room and took it out of his hands. He went absolutely still. She had not touched him. In 11 days she had not touched him. She had barely spoken to him. She understood now with a clarity that made her want to be sick, treated him with the precise quantity of consideration she gave to a lift door. "Hold your arm out," she said. He held his arm out. The burn ran from the wrist to the elbow, black at the edges and wet in the middle, and it was going to scar horribly, and it was on the arm he had put between her and a gun. She had never dressed a wound. She did it slowly, badly, and with total concentration, and neither of them said anything for 4 minutes. Then, without looking up, she said, "Why did you tell me to walk on your left?" "Because the balconies were on the east, ma'am, and you were shorter than me on that side." "I am not shorter than you." "Sitting, standing, or moving, ma'am, if I'm on your right, my body is behind you and it stops nothing." He shrugged with the shoulder that still worked. "On your left, I'm between you and the tiers." "That's all it was." "That's all it was," she repeated. She tied off the wrap. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking. They had not shaken during the ambush. They were shaking now in a hot little room on the 9th underdeck, and she looked at them with a kind of distant scientific curiosity and thought, "Ah, there it is. That is what I look like." "Auxiliary Ferrow," she said, "how many did you kill?" He looked up. "4, ma'am." "How many did you not kill?" A pause, that pause, the counting out of words. "5, he said. "Why?" "Because 4 was what it took." He made her sleep. That was one of the small, strange indignities of that long day. The human simply informed her at the 3rd hour that she was going to lie down on the batting next to her cousin and close her eyes for 40 minutes, and when she began to explain the several reasons why this was absurd, he listened to all of them politely, and then said, "Yes, ma'am." 40 minutes, and she lay down and she slept. When she woke, he had rigged a tap off the water line and found a ration cache in a wall locker and laid out, on a piece of clean insulation, an inventory of everything they possessed. 4 ration bricks, 2 liters of water, 1 kit, 1 knife, 2 coil pistols with a combined 14 shots, 1 broken Ilvaranet hachet, and 1 station schematic he had drawn from memory on the back of a maintenance placard in grease pencil. She looked at the schematic for a long time. It was appallingly good. It had the coolant trunk on it and the crawl access hatches, and the 3 exits from the substation, and the stair, and the whole eastern spine of the station drawn in a spidery, careful hand with distances marked in paces. When did you make this? Days 3 through 9, ma'am. On my off shift. You walked the station, why? He looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his particular expression of incomprehension, not offense, genuine, patient bafflement, the look of a man being asked why he breathes. Because I didn't know the ground, he said. Oren woke at the 6th hour and was sick, and wept a little, and apologized for weeping, and Iselye held his hand and told him with perfect composure that he was being ridiculous, and did not let go of his hand for an hour. Cade Ferrow, sitting by the door with a pistol across his knee and his eyes on the stair, did not appear to notice any of it. But when Oren finally slept again, he said, quietly, without turning around, "He'll live, ma'am. Ilverin run cold, but he's got a good pulse." And Iselye Vannareth put her face in her hands briefly, for the first and only time, and was grateful that the human had the decency to keep looking at the door. At the 8th hour they talked. The station had gone very quiet above them, and the emergency channels were saying nothing, and there was nothing to do but wait for a rescue that Cade Ferrow had already, in his flat way, explained was not coming. "They'll have the search," he said. "Cassalt runs the search, he'll run it wherever we aren't. You are accusing an Imperial warden of treason. On what evidence?" "The movement order," said Cade. "He signed it. He routed us into a room with 2 exits and 9 tiers of cover and a glass roof on the morning of the quorum, and he increased the honor guard with 8 faces that don't belong to this station, and when I told him about the hatch he wrote a note in my file." He shifted the pistol on his knee. "That's not evidence, ma'am. I know it's not evidence, but it's a count." Iselye sat with that. She was, whatever else she was, a woman who had spent 4 years learning to read a corrupt logistics system from its inefficiencies. She knew what it looked like when a number had a hand behind it. "He will say it was you," she said slowly, "won't he?" "Yes, ma'am." The human auxiliary, the colonial from the Deathworld, with a file full of notes about hypervigilance and unsanctioned surveys of restricted decks and insubordination toward a serving steward. She heard her own voice from a great distance. "You wandered the station. You drew a map of it. You walked the service corridor behind the atrium 3 days before the atrium was destroyed. Every single thing you did to protect me is a line in the indictment." "Yes, ma'am." They will say the human snapped and killed the delegation, and the Prefect-Envoy of House Vannareth died because the Imperium was foolish enough to let a savage stand behind her chair. She looked up. "And then the Tarn lane goes to drawl by default, and the Corps stops taking colonials, and everyone gets exactly what they wanted." Cade Ferrow said nothing. He had known this, she realized, since roughly 941. He had known it while he was climbing a wall. "Auxiliary," she said, "why did they choose me?" He turned around then. He looked at her across the little hot humming room, and he said it without any bitterness at all, which was the thing that broke her. "They didn't choose you, ma'am. They chose the delegation with no real security on it." He nodded once at himself. "They gave you me. That's what made you the easy one." He had known that for 11 days. That was what she could not get past. She sat in the red light of a coolant substation and looked at a 23-year-old human boy, and understood that he had stood in her corridor 6 hours a night with his back to a wall, knowing the entire time that his presence beside her was itself the reason she was going to be killed. "Does it not," she stopped, started again, "does it not enrage you?" "Ma'am, they put you next to me as an insult. Not to you, to me. You were the message." Her voice was rising and she let it. "You were the Imperium's way of telling every house on that station that Vannareth did not matter enough to guard, and you knew it, and you stood there, and you counted hatches." "Yes, ma'am," said Cade Ferrow. "Why?" And the human boy from Karrow looked at the woman who had called him decoration to his face and said, "Because you were still the one I was for." Iselye Vannareth had been trained in 9 forms of rhetoric. She could recite the conquered articles in 2 dead languages. She had no answer to that, not one word. So she said, instead, the other thing. The thing that had been sitting in her chest since 940 like a stone. "I did not believe you." "No, ma'am. You brought me 9 facts and I called it coolant." She was crying. She noticed, distantly, the way she had noticed her hands shaking. "You told me not to go and I went, because if I had not gone I would have looked like a fool, and I have spent 90 years making certain that I never look like a fool, and a man is dead in that atrium because of it. 2 men, 4. She looked at the ceiling. "I do not know how many. I did not count. You counted." Cade Ferrow sat by the door with the pistol on his knee, and for a long moment he did not say anything. Then, in his plain, flat voice, he said something that she would think about for 210 years. "Ma'am, I've got a note in my file that says I'm broken." She turned her head. "It says I'm hypervigilant. It means I look at things when nobody's told me to." He was not looking at her. He was looking at the stair because someone had to look at the stair. "I read that note about 400 times on the transit out, and I remember thinking, all right then, I'll be less. I'll stand where they put me and I'll look at the middle of the room like everybody else, and I'll be a good lamp, because these people have been running a galaxy for 10,000 years, and I'm a kid from a rock, so probably they know what a person's supposed to be, and I don't." He stopped. 11 days, he said. "I've been trying to be less for 11 days, and this morning at 9:40 I stopped trying and 4 people are alive." The substation hummed. "So no, ma'am," said Cade Ferrow. "I'm not angry that you thought I was furniture." He finally turned and looked at her, and his flat, unbeautiful face was perfectly calm and perfectly terrible. "I'm angry that I believed you." They moved at the 10th hour. They moved because Cade heard the search sweep 3 decks up and did not like the pattern of it. "They're not searching, ma'am, they're hurting." And because the water line had begun to run warm, which meant someone had cut the plant's return upstream, which meant someone had worked out that a coolant substation was exactly where a colonial would go. And they moved because Iselye Vannareth, sitting on a housing in a ruined coat with her cousin's blood on her hands, had done the only thing she was actually good at. She had done the arithmetic. "The quorum," she said. Cade paused at the door. "The adjudicators sit *once auxiliary. The articles require them to render the disposition of the lane within 1 station day of the appointed hour, or the matter reverts to the standing charter, and the standing charter on the Tarn corridor is held, provisionally, in escrow by the senior client house present." She stood up. She pulled her mother's coat straight over the torn shoulder, and her hands, she noticed, had stopped shaking entirely. House draw. "In 11 hours, if no Vannareth chair is filled in the Hall of Concord, Consul Draw will be handed the thing he tried to murder me for, and he will be handed it lawfully signed by 7 adjudicators who believe I am dead in the vacuum with a mad human's hands around my throat." The human looked at her for a long moment. "That's a long way up, ma'am," he said. "Cassault has the spine. He'll have shut the lifts, and he'll have the hall doors, and he'll have every Vorik on the station between us and that chair, and I've got 7 shots in 1 arm." He said it flatly, without complaint, laying the pieces on the table the way he laid out everything. "I need you to hear the count before you decide. That's all. I'll walk into it, but I need you to actually hear it first." Iselye Vannareth crossed the little red room and picked up the grease pencil schematic he had drawn on the back of a maintenance placard, out of nothing, out of paces on his off shift, because he had not known the ground. "I hear it," she said. "Auxiliary Ferrow, I am going to that chair. I would like you to come with me." And then, because she was 90 years old and Ilvaran, and had never in her life asked anyone for anything, She made herself add, "Please." They went up through the bones of the station. Cade Ferrow led, and Iselye Vannareth followed, and Orin Sath came behind on a strap around his cousin's shoulder, because he had woken at the 10th hour and refused, with a stubbornness she had not known he possessed, to be left in a hot room to be found by Kassalt's people. Cade rigged the strap out of banner silk he had cut from the atrium wall on the way out, 11 hours ago, without comment, because he had thought they might need rope. The crawl trunk ran the eastern spine, 19 decks, sealed at every second junction. Cade opened them with the knife, with a length of pipe, and twice by putting his shoulder into a plate and pushing until the welds let go. And he did it so quietly that Iselye, 4 paces behind him, could not hear it happening. She had time to think in there, too much time. She thought about the articles. She had learned them at 11 years old, in a cold room on the Vannareth terraces, from a tutor who beat the backs of her hands with a rod when she misplaced a clause. She had understood even then that she was learning it because House Vannareth had nothing else, no fleet, no friends, no coin, and that the law was the only weapon left in a poor house's cupboard. Article 9. The right of the silent gallery. The chair of an envoy is filled by her voice and not by her seat. Where an envoy is prevented, by violence or by mischance, from taking her place upon the floor of Concord, she may be heard from any tier of the hall, and the bench shall hear her, and the bench shall not adjourn until she is done. 2,000 years old. A dead letter. Nobody had invoked it since the sundering, because nobody in 2,000 years had needed to. Envoys walked through doors. Iselye Vannareth, crawling on her elbows through a maintenance trunk with a dead man's blood on her coat, laughed out loud in the dark. Cade Ferrow stopped and looked back at her. "I have the law," she told him, and her voice came out cracked and strange and fierce. "Auxiliary. I do not need the doors, I need a balcony." He got her one. The Hall of Concord had survived. It lay inward of the atrium, behind 2 pressure bulkheads, and the 7 adjudicators were in it, and the quorum clock was running, and outside its doors Warden Kassalt had assembled 40 personnel in the name of the search. Above it, unlit, ran the 9 tiers. Cade got them to the 7th at the 17th hour, through a hatch that was not on any schematic the Imperium had ever given an auxiliary, and he put Orin down against a wall and crouched at the balustrade, looking down into the great warm gold-lit well of the hall with an expression of absolutely flat attention. 2 on the 5th tier stair, he said, 1 on the 8th, Vorak. "Can we?" "No, ma'am." "Wait." He was silent for a while. Iselye, kneeling beside him in the dark with her heart going and her hands filthy, made herself wait too. "There's a 4th, Cade said at last. "Where?" "I don't know." She looked at him. "He's not moving, that's how I know. 3 of them are shifting weight, changing feet, breathing out loud. Those are guards, ma'am. They're bored. Somewhere in this gallery there's a 4th one who hasn't moved in an hour, and he's not bored, and he's not here to hold a stare." He sat back on his heels. "Kassalt sent a hunter." The word went through Iselye like cold water. "You can hear him," she said. "No, ma'am, that's the point. I can hear everything else." He wiped his hand across his mouth, and she saw, in the dim gold spill from below, that his fingers were unsteady. "There's a hole in the room where a person should be. That's a blooded hand. That's what they are. He's been sitting still since before we got here, because Kassalt worked out an hour ago that if I was alive I'd come to the tiers, and he stopped hunting us and started waiting for us instead." "Then he is exactly like you." "Yes, ma'am," said Cade Ferrow. "That's what I've been telling you." The plan was hers. That was the thing Iselye would insist upon later, in the record, over the objections of 9 separate committees who wanted very badly for it to have been anyone else's. The plan was hers, and it was made out of the only material she had ever had, which was the law and the certainty of what men like Vekit Dral and Kassalt would do when cornered. "He cannot let me speak," she said. Article 9 binds the bench. The moment they hear me, the moment 7 adjudicators know that the Prefect-Envoy Vannareth is alive and in this hall, the quorum cannot adjourn and the lane cannot revert, and everything they have built collapses. So he will stop me. He must. And to stop me, he will have to do it in front of the bench. Cade went very still. "Ma'am, you have 13 shots left in 2 pistols and 1 working arm," said Iselye Vannareth. "There are 40 personnel between us and those doors, 3 Vorik on the stairs, and a blooded hand somewhere in this gallery who has not moved in an hour. You cannot fight them, Auxiliary. I have heard the count." She pulled her mother's ruined coat straight and fastened the 4 clasps that remained and lifted her chin. "So we will not fight them. I am going to walk out onto that balcony and invoke a 2,000-year-old procedure, and Warden Cassault is going to lose his composure in front of 7 adjudicators of the Imperium, and that is how we win." She looked at him, and her voice, for one moment, one only, went out from under her. "I need 11 minutes, she said. "That is all I have ever needed. 11 minutes and a bench that has to listen. Can you give me 11 minutes? Cade Ferrow looked at the dark of the 7th tier, where a thing that had been trained for 9,000 years was sitting somewhere very close by, not moving. "No, ma'am," he said, "but I can give you 4. He put her in a niche. It was a maintenance recess behind a fluted column, 80 centimeters deep, and he put her into it with her back to the stone, and Oren slumped at her feet, and he crouched in front of her and said, in a voice so quiet it was barely air, "Ma'am, he's going to come along this tier. He'll come slow. He might take 20 minutes. Where will you be?" "Here," he pointed at the floor, a meter away in the black shadow under the balustrade. "Right here. He will see you." "No, ma'am, he'll asterisk here asterisk me if I move." Cade's eyes were steady on hers, very close in the dark. "That's the whole of it. Whoever moves first loses. That's all it ever is. And if he doesn't move, then we sit here until the quorum runs out and Drawl gets his lane." He almost smiled. It was a terrible little expression and it did not reach anything. "So he'll move. He knows the clock too." Iselye Vannareth pressed her spine to cold stone. "Auxiliary Ferrow," she whispered, "what do I do?" And the boy from Karrow, the decoration, the lamp, the bollard, the 100 kilograms of hired attention with nowhere to put itself, said, "Nothing, ma'am. Be still. You're better at it than anybody I've ever met." He was right. That was the last unbearable gift of that day, and Iselye received it standing in an 80-centimeter niche on the 7th tier of the Hall of Concord, with her cousin bleeding on her boots. 9 minutes. She stood for 9 minutes without moving. She did not shift her weight. She did not swallow. There was blood running from a cut above her eyebrow, and it went into her eye, and it stung, and she did not blink it away. Because 90 years ago a tutor with a rod had taught an 11-year-old girl that a Vannareth does not fidget, and 40 years ago a court had taught a young woman that the first person to move in a silence has conceded it. And 11 days ago she had stood at a table in the Auxiliary Gallery and let a man call her escort a bollard without one single muscle of her face betraying her. She had built a person who could hold absolutely still under any pressure the universe could bring. She had thought it was armor. She had thought it was vanity. It turned out to be a weapon, and she used it, and she did not move. At 9 minutes and 40 seconds, something came along the 7th tier. It made no sound at all. She only knew it was there because the gold light from the hall below, spilling up through the balustrade in long soft bars, went out and came back 1 bar, then the next as something enormous walked through them. It stopped 4 meters away. She could smell it, dry, hot mineral like a stone in the sun. She could hear it breathing, and the breathing was so slow, so patient, so entirely unhurried, that Iselye Vannareth understood in one plunging instant what it was to be looked at by something that had all the time in the world. Whoever moves first loses. And Iselye, who had spent 11 days looking at a human boy and seeing a lamp, who had walked into an atrium because she could not bear to be laughed at, who had 4 years in one house and 11 minutes riding on the next second of her life, chose to move. She stepped out of the niche, into the bars of gold light, into the open, and she lifted her chin and said, in the ringing court voice that could fill the Aulic gallery end to end, "You are addressing a Prefect-Envoy of the Imperium." The blooded hand turned its head. It was 1 degree, maybe less, 9,000 years of breeding and a hunter's stillness, and it gave her *1 degree of its attention. And the shadow under the balustrade came up off the floor. It was not beautiful. There was no swing, no arc, no exchange. The human went in under 2.5 meters of Imperial killing machine and stayed there, inside its reach, in the little dead space against its chest where the arms could not work, and he did something with the knife that she did not see and did not want to. The blooded hand went down on one knee. It got a hand on him and it threw him, and Cade Ferrow went 4 meters across the tier and hit the stone and rolled and came back immediately before he had finished rolling, before any body should have been able to. And he was there when the thing tried to stand, and he took the leg, and it went down, and it did not get up. It took 11 seconds. Afterward the human knelt beside it in the dark, breathing in great shuddering pulls, and he was shaking, and he did not look at the thing he had killed. Then he stood up and wiped his hand on his ruined gray and said hoarsely, "Ma'am, the balcony." At 4:09 on the second station day, in the 17th hour of a quorum that 7 adjudicators of the Imperium had been about to adjourn, a woman appeared on the 7th tier of the Hall of Concord. Her coat was torn. There was blood on her face. She stood at the balustrade in the gold light with a maintenance placard in one hand, a schematic, drawn in grease pencil with distances marked in paces, and she raised her voice into the great vault and said, "Article 9. The chair of an envoy is filled by her voice and not by her seat. The bench will hear me, and the bench will not adjourn until I have done." 200 faces turned up toward her. And Warden Cassault of Vessendar Station, standing at the foot of the hall in the uniform of an Imperial security service 10,000 years old, in front of 7 adjudicators and 400 delegates, and every recording instrument in the Tarn system, looked up at the woman he had murdered 18 hours ago, and lost his composure. She had said he would. It was the only prediction she made that day, and she made it out of 90 years of watching men who were used to winning discover that they were not going to. He shouted, "Kill her !" and 40 personnel did not move, and 3 Vorik on the stairs did not move, and 1 very frightened contract shooter on the 8th tier did what he was told. Iselye did not see him fire. She only saw the world go sideways, and the stone of the balustrade jump, and she was on the floor of the 7th tier with 100 kilograms of auxiliary on top of her and a hole through the meat of his good shoulder. And Cade Ferrow was saying, into her ear in a perfectly calm voice, as though he were reporting the weather, "It's all right, ma'am, he's the only one shooting." He was the only one shooting, in the Hall of Concord, in front of the bench, on the order of an Imperial warden, at an envoy invoking Article 9. It took the adjudicators 4 seconds to understand what they had just watched. It took them 1 more to begin, in the terrible, dry, ancient voice of the Imperium, to render. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did it standing, with her hand pressed into a stranger's shoulder to stop the bleeding, and she did not once look at Vekit Drawl, whose client house had wired 11 million to a C-Thin warden's private account through 4 shells that house Vannareth's forensic auditors, who were very good, because they were all that House Vannareth had unpicked in 9 days. She won the lane. That was almost the smallest part of it, though it was the part the news feeds led with. Vannarethtakes Tarn, Dral indicted, warden executed under Article 6. She fixed the corridor. The transit loss curves came true, all of them, and in 40 years House Vannareth had 9 seats again and no debt schedule at all. That was not what she was remembered for. What she was remembered for was the 6th day of the inquiry. The Corps had come to give evidence, and they had come with a file, and the file was read into the record by a very junior officer with a very careful voice, and it contained a note. Auxiliary Ferrow, Karrow, 1.4G Colonial, continues to display persistent hypervigilance behaviors unsuited to ceremonial posting. Subject repeatedly surveys structures, exits, and personnel without instruction. Recommend remedial deportment instruction prior to further high-visibility assignment. Iselye Vannareth asked for it to be read a second time. Then she stood up in front of the bench of the Imperium, in a coat with 11 clasps, and she said, "Note the word, unsuited, not asterisk incorrect, not asterisk mistaken. Every single fact in that file was true. He surveyed the structures and the structure was a killing box. He surveyed the exits and there were 2. He surveyed the personnel and 8 of them had come to murder me." She let the silence go long because she was very good at silence. The Imperium looked at a man who was paying attention, and it could not think of anything to call that except a defect. And then it gave him to me, as a decoration, because it believed that a species which cannot stop watching for danger must be a species with nothing else in it. She looked down the length of the bench. I will tell this bench what I learned in that white room. When a human is frightened for you, he does not become fast, or strong, or terrible. He becomes attentive. He was attentive the whole time, standing behind my chair while I ignored him, standing in a corridor at 4 in the morning while I slept, and I looked at him for 11 days and saw furniture, because I had been taught by a great and ancient civilization that anything which serves is a thing without an interior. The record shows a pause of 11 seconds there. It is the longest pause in the transcript. "Strike the note," said Iselye Vannareth, "and strike the word from the standard and from every auxiliary file in the service, because it is not a diagnosis. It is a compliment that the Imperium was too proud to recognize." They struck it. It took 2 years. The Imperium did nothing quickly, but they struck it, and the standard was rewritten, and somewhere in the vast grinding machinery of a 10,000-year-old empire, a small thing changed, and colonial children stopped being told that the way their grandmothers had taught them to listen was a disorder. Cade Ferrow was 24 by then. He did not take the commission they offered him, or the estate, or the Vannareth name, all of which were offered twice. He took his old post back, half a step ahead of her left shoulder, hands loose, head up. He stood in corridors. He counted hatches. He walked the ground of every station they came to, and drew it in grease pencil from memory, and nobody wrote a note about it ever again. At a supper on Galsarin, 4 years later, a young lord of a great house leaned across the table and asked the Prefect-Envoy whether it was true that she kept a human, and whether they were as decorative as everyone said. Iselye Vannareth set down her cup. She did not look at Cade, standing at the wall, watching the galleries, the way he had watched them every day of his life since he was 4 years old on a porch on a world that wanted him dead. "On the 4th day," she said, "the Corps sent me an order. It said, assigned 1 bodyguard. I read it and I filed it, and I did not think about it again for 11 days. She turned her cup a quarter turn on the cloth. "I have kept that order. It is framed in my study on Vannareth. I wrote 1 line beneath it in my own hand, and I read it every morning before I go out among people like you." The young lord waited, delighted, expecting an epigram. "It says, I was wrong about the word." And she picked up her cup and drank, and the table found something else to talk about, and behind her, in the shadow of the wall, in a room with 9 tiers of dark balconies, the boy from Karrow went on quietly, patiently, without instruction, doing the only thing he had ever been for. He watched the doors,